Is intolerance a necessary precondition to having a functioning, open, tolerant society? Let's get into that question. All right, so today we're going to talk about Karl Popper. And specifically, we're going to talk about Karl Popper's famous paradox of tolerance, which is stated in his 1945 work, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And it's roughly as follows. This is Karl Popper's own words. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. So that's a basic summary, pulling from a quote from that book, which is much larger work involving philosophy of science as well as political science and some other topics. But briefly today, I want to talk about the paradox of tolerance, what it means, and how we might think about it in our own context. So, as he said there, if you create a tolerant society, you always run the risk of it being basically co-opted by intolerant people. Because if you're tolerant of everyone, if you're supremely tolerant, then you're also tolerant of the intolerant, paradoxically. And what this leads to over time is something Nassim Taleb termed the dictatorship of the small minority, right? So if you have an intransigent minority, a minority that's more intolerant than the majority that's around, then ultimately they end up winning. And the reason they end up winning is because, well, the other side is actually just more tolerant. And so they will continue to give up ground to the intolerant side, despite the fact that there's more of them. And this rule of the small minority is something that Nassim Taleb talks about. And in fact, it only takes about 3 to 4% of a given population in order to renormalize an entire, domain to the preferences of this intransigent minority that refuses to do anything. So, for example, you'll see on a lot of drinks, it's probably there's probably one on my little Dr. Pepper here somewhere. It may not be I don't think it's on the bottom, but there's probably somewhere on here. I can't really find it right now, but there's probably somewhere on here a little C or a little K, that indicates that this is a kosher drink, right? As far as I know, there's no animal products in here, so it should have the little K on it. And people who don't know about kosher food don't know this, but in fact, many of the packaged drinks that you'll buy in the stores in the United States here are marked for kosher. Now, why do they need to, adjust the printing machines that make these plastic bottles and every other drink here in the United States to mark them off as kosher when only a super small percentage of the population even eats kosher? Well, that's because there's an intransigent minority. There's a minority of people, even a very small minority, who simply will not purchase, they will not drink the non-kosher drinks. And because of the fact that the cost of making it kosher and marking it as so is low enough that it doesn't really affect the majority group who are not kosher, then you can easily just make that transition over. Now, it can still happen this way even if the cost isn't that high, but this is just sort of an arbitrary economic example to show that you only need a really small percentage of people who will just not move on an issue in order to change the whole society, because of course the rest of the society is more adaptable, they're more flexible, they're willing to do things, they're willing to change because they're the tolerant ones. And so this paradox of tolerance, I think, creates an interesting problem for liberalism because, well, the idea behind a liberal society is that, it's open to everybody, there's free sharing of ideas, there's free thought, there's free speech, and of course, the problem is that if we're talking about the paradox of tolerance, well, then there's also going to be free speech and free thought and the ability to promote non-liberal ideas, which is, I think, one of the big pressures that we're running up against at this point in history, where liberalism couldn't really, or at least the founders of liberalism, couldn't really predict the rise of the internet. And one of the things that's happening on the internet is you've got this Cambrian explosion of new ideas from new people all over the world, everyone sharing different ideas, and especially here in the United States, where we have strong freedom of speech protections, that means that there are going to be anti-liberal ideas. There are going to be ideas which go against the very tenets of the society that makes it possible for them to be spread, that will be allowed to be spread. Now, I talked in my last free speech video, which I'm going to link up here, about the fact that there are going to be illiberal ideas coming down the line, and it's going to intersect with free speech, and it's going to get harder and harder to continue to defend the liberal order against non-liberal ideas, as these ideas that are opposed to it continue to proliferate. And so one of the questions that we have just as people is to figure out what exactly are the limits of tolerance, and can you truly have a tolerant society that is also tolerant of intolerance, or playing devil's advocate here, or do you necessarily have to clamp down on intolerance? Do you have to say, look, we have this tolerant society, and paradoxically, we tolerate everybody except the people who are intolerant, right? And of course, this gets brought up too, not only as in the context of racism or sexism or whatever other ism you want to come up with that may be intolerant, even communism, right? So we have a liberal society, and that means that by our own rules, we allow anti-liberal ideas like communism, like fascism, etc., to be shared. And we don't clamp down on it, at least not in a legal sense. There may be additional social pressures that happen, although increasingly those social pressures are going further against more free speech. And so we are getting a little bit, I'd say, of a kind of resolution of the paradox of tolerance in the form of people are getting more intolerant of intolerance. Now, there are, of course, favorite categories for intolerance that we're intolerant of. We tend to be pretty tolerant of anyone that's critical of the regime, anyone that's critical of neoliberalism, even capitalism. You can basically say whatever you want about capitalism here, despite the fact that we are ostensibly a really hyper-capitalist society. And I think actually that's an interesting argument against the idea of late-stage capitalism. Of course, you can always just say that, the reason why you allow free speech against capitalism is actually a sort of release valve on the excesses of capitalism. You could sort of allow people to complain, and then because they can complain, they sort of let out their energies through that, and it kind of dissipates any kind of more stronger revolutionary energy that might come about. Those are interesting discussions that, it's sort of perniciously allowing dissent against the ruling ideology in order to actually relinquish the revolutionary energies. And I think there are even more deeper arguments to be made about different ways in which that could be true within liberalism. I think liberalism does have this sort of amorphous character in which it tends to absorb even the competing ideologies that exist within itself. And so maybe that sort of cannibalism of competing ideologies is a way in which the paradox of tolerance manages to stick around. But regardless, there are obviously certain kinds of intolerance that we are willing to tolerate, and certain kinds of intolerance that we're not willing to tolerate. So, for example, we're not willing to tolerate, generally speaking, any kind of intolerance towards people because of their race or gender or sexuality, whereas we are willing to tolerate people who have intolerance towards various kinds of various kinds of religious groups up until recently. I mean, it seems like there was a lot of real respect for different religions for a long time here in the United States. We were, founded as a place for religious exiles to come and live and practice their religion freely. And increasingly, it's become, at least in the social sphere, acceptable to deride religion, to deride religious people, to make fun of them, to call them, tell them that they're foolish, to tell them that their ideas don't make any sense, that they're backwards-looking people, even accuse them of some of these other isms that we've talked about by virtue of the fact that they hold these beliefs. And so I'm seeing that as one of the angles in which things are really not becoming more tolerant. So that these are the different cleavages that exist here, and this idea gets misrepresented quite a lot by people both on the left and the right. People who obviously have never read Karl Popper's work. I actually did my senior thesis in part drawing on the open society, and so I had to read. I didn't read the entire thing for that, but I did manage to process large chunks of it for part of my thesis. Of course, my thesis wasn't based on that. So anyway, but this is the paradox of tolerance, and it's a continuous challenge. And the people who are the strongest critics of liberalism generally, even people that want to see it destroyed, people like accelerationists, both on the left and the right, have a solid point when they bring this up, which is that there is this problem of how do you be tolerant of intolerance, and should you be extremely tolerant to the extent that you even tolerate the most intolerance possible, so much intolerance that it threatens the system. I think one of the assumptions that we should look at in Karl Popper's phrasing of this paradox here is this assumption that allowing the intolerant to exist within an open society will necessarily lead to that society becoming intolerant. And that's really the question that I'm posing to you, and that I think we should think about quite a lot, because there's this alternate theory, as I said, that it could instead be a release valve. It could be, in fact, a way to sort of dissipate alternative energies. I don't know necessarily that there is such a thing as true idea suppression. Obviously, you can prevent political movements from gaining momentum. You can lock up dissidents. You can do all kinds of things if you're a more authoritarian regime to try to clamp down on anyone who is dissenting from what you're saying. But I don't think that ultimately that entirely works. And so I do think that, strangely enough, the paradox of tolerance may actually be more of a strength than a weakness to the liberal regime. And that's where me and Karl Popper might differ. Let me know what you think in the comments. The paradox of tolerance, have you heard of it before? What do you think of it? Do you think that it represents a strong criticism of liberalism? Do you think it represents a credible threat? Do you think that there does need to be some clamping down on the intolerant? Or should we be ultimately tolerant even of the people who would like us to be intolerant ourselves? I'll see you guys next time.